Although the United States possesses the right to regulate its immigration, a country bears a responsibility to uphold their foundations and treaties. The Chinese Exclusion Acts between 1882 and 1943 contradicted the pursuit of equality and anti-discrimination in the United States, as well as violated the Burlingame Treaty. It marked the climax for decades of resentment towards Chinese immigrants. Although later repealed, the unjust policy continued to taint America and established an everlasting impact and reminder. Addiction to opium crippled China's strength and productivity at the turn of the 19th century. Many countries took advantage of this condition. Following the First Opium War in 1842, France, Britain, and the United States formed treaties with China to access the lucrative trade market. When China failed to adhere to these treaties, France and Britain both responded with force. Meanwhile, the United States resolved the matter diplomatically. Consequently, we created a much more favorable Treaty of Tianjin and a deeper relationship with China when the treaties were re-established in 1858. Although the Treaty of Tianjin listed the spoils obtained from the Opium War, more importantly, the first article stated, "There shall be, as there have always been, peace and friendship between the United States of America and the Chinese Empire." Then, in 1861, Anson Burlingame worked to establish the United States as a power in the East. The United States sought to gain access to several ports of China, and Burlingame's negotiations led to the creation of a revised version of the Treaty of Tianjin in 1862, the Burlingame Treaty. This treaty protected commerce in the Chinese ports lent to the United States. Furthermore, the treaty included the United States of America and the Emperor of China recognized the inherent and unalienable right of man to change his home and allegiance, and also the mutual advantage of free migration of their citizens and subjects. The treaty guaranteed the right of free migration as well as full protection of immigrants, and both countries bore the responsibility to uphold it. Chinese immigrants arrived at Angel Island primarily in hopes of labor opportunity. When construction began on the Continental Railroad, the United States welcomed its largest group of Chinese immigrants. The chief engineer, Montague, described to the Board of the Central Pacific, "They are faithful and under proper supervision soon become skillful in the performance of their duties. Many of them are becoming very expert in drilling, blasting, and other departments of rock work." By 1868, the Central Pacific workforce included over 12,000 Chinese immigrants, 80% of the whole workforce. However, the majority of Chinese immigrants sent money back to their struggling families in China. They also owed loans for their passage to America. Because of these financial pressures, the Chinese had little options but to accept unbearably low wages. Others required higher wages to support their families in the United States.
They faced a lot of discrimination, a lot of racial intolerance because they were seen as working for lower wages, taking jobs at a time when unemployment was 25-30% in some communities.
James B. Weaver, president of the Greenbackers Party, remarked, "Slavery being simply cheap labor, and cheap labor being simply slavery, the importation of Chinese tends to brutalize and degrade American labor. Therefore, immediate steps should be taken to abrogate the Burlingame Treaty." Anti-Chinese sentiments developed quickly and the country was edging towards strict immigration policy. Chinese resentment forced racism to reach its peak as America neared the 1880s. In a San Antonio courtroom involving an Irishman named Paddy O'Rourke, who had shot and killed a Chinese railroad worker, Judge Roy Bean stated, "Homicide is the killing of a human being. However, I can find no law against the killing of a Chinaman." Paddy O'Rourke was let free with no charges. American laborers, especially in California, urged the United States to take action against the Chinese immigrants. Newspapers overflowed with offensive anti-Chinese articles and cartoons. Senator Aaron A. Sargent of California an anti-Chinese crusader, explained, "Chinamen, as a race, are addicted to all nameless vices, characteristic of the Asiatics. There can be no remedy but general exclusion." The pressure convinced Congress to pass a bill in 1879 known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, which would ban immigration from China to the United States. Upon the President's consent, the law would be established. President Rutherford B. Hayes announced on February 20, 1879, "We shall oppress the Chinamen, but I suspect that this bill is inconsistent with our treaty obligations. If it violates the national faith, I must decline to sign it." Chinese exclusion went against the national responsibilities of America. However, 3 years later, President Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act into law on May 6, 1882. Whereas in the opinion of the United States, the coming of Chinese laborers to this country endangers the good order of certain localities, and until the expiration of 10 years, the coming of Chinese laborers to the United States shall be suspended. And with the flick of the pen, the first and only law to ban a group of immigrants solely on the basis of race had been implemented. The United States had little concern towards those who even frightened the public more. The Chinese was the only one barred out. Although it was clear that the Chinese were being discriminated against, most either left or decided to quietly endure the next 10 years. In the first 14 months after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, the Chinese Bureau in San Francisco recorded a total of 11,434 departures of Chinese residents. This trend sustained over the next 10 years. The chief inspector of the port, S.J. Rudo, remarked that the Chinese Exclusion Act made a very marked difference among the Chinese population, and if the trend continued, the Chinese communities might completely disappear. At the same time, some Chinese continued to illegally enter the country. When 1892 arrived, just prior to the expiration of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Geary Act was passed, extending the prohibition of Chinese immigration for another 10 years. In addition, it required Chinese citizens to carry identifications at all times. Finally, in 1902, a third act was established. This act stated, "Be it enacted that all laws now in force prohibiting and regulating the coming of Chinese persons into the United States be reenacted, extended, and continued until otherwise provided by law." The Chinese Exclusion Act had been made permanent. In addition to preventing Chinese from entering the country, Chinese exclusion also fueled the racism towards Chinese Americans. The limited remaining Chinese workers were paid extremely low, and many Americans refused to hire those of Chinese descent. The country took a turn in 1939 when World War II began. Both China and the United States were in war with Japan, so the United States allied with China. China supported the United States with soldiers, weapons, and housing for the United States soldiers. To maintain their alliance, the United States passed the Magnuson Act in 1943. The following acts, or part of acts, relating to the exclusion or deportation of persons of the Chinese race are hereby repealed. Even so, the 1943 Act allowed only 105 Chinese immigrants per year, and it was not until the Immigration Act of 1965, which eliminated previous national origins policy, that large-scale Chinese immigration to the United States began once again after a hiatus of over 80 years. Historians and politicians look back to see that the United States failed to uphold their responsibilities. They had failed to follow the treaties they agreed upon and the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. In May 26, 2011, a bill was introduced to Congress. Resolved that the House of Representatives 1. Acknowledges that this framework of anti-Chinese legislation is incompatible with the basic founding principles recognized in the Declaration of Independence, and that all persons are created equal. 2. Acknowledges that the Chinese Exclusion Act is incompatible with the spirit of the United States Constitution. 3. Deeply regrets passing 6 decades of legislation directly targeting the Chinese people. And 4. Reaffirms its commitment to preserving the same civil rights and constitutional protections for people of Chinese or other Asian descent in the United States accorded to all others, regardless of their race or ethnicity.